People should understand we have three conflict zones in the world right now involving the United States. One is Ukraine. The second is Israel's wars in the Middle East. I'll call them wars because Israel is in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria. And the United States is right there with Israel on everything, including, as you say, the bombing of Yemen and the threats to bomb Iran. The third conflict area, so far, Cold War, if you could put it that way, is with China. But there too, the administration's rhetoric is utterly bellicose, talking about preparing for possible coming war in most irresponsible and reckless ways. By the way, when it comes to issues in the Western Hemisphere, there's no language of peace. The rhetoric about Canada is disgusting. The rhetoric about Greenland is as bellicose as it can get, to claim that another country or territory of another country is going to become America's. The rhetoric vis-a-vis much of South America is similar, in Central America regarding Panama and other countries. So this is not peace talk. This is all mixed up. But in Ukraine, okay, good progress to some extent. But in the rest of the world, a lot of bellicosity. And what is happening inside the administration, apparently, vis-a-vis China, is a lot of war talk, preparing for war. This is not yet the public face. This is what is apparently being said in semi-private. There seems nothing to be completely private in this administration, but at least this is what the scuttlebutt in Washington is, that there's war talk, war drums beating vis-a-vis China. So no, this is not an administration of peace. This is an administration that is pursuing, I'd say, multiple and contradictory approaches to American foreign policy. So I had hoped when Trump came into office that he would be a person of peace. I think what he's doing in Ukraine is positive and noteworthy, although a bit clumsy and inconsistent. What he's doing in the Middle East is doubling down on Israel's massacres and complete reckless behavior and war crimes and viciousness, the likes of which we have not seen for a very long time. I would say with the British, it is a long tradition of Russophobia, a tradition that actually dates back almost 2 centuries. After all, Britain fought the first Crimean War, essentially like our current Ukraine war, which I call the Second Crimean War. That was a war in which the British Empire fought Russia to try to push Russia out of the Black Sea region, because the British Empire thought that Russia was a competitor. And the British concocted fairy tales about the Russian intention to invade British India, the great game of Central Asia. All in all, it's to say that European positions, to my mind, make no sense. I've told European leaders that for years. They have succeeded in getting Ukraine to the point of destruction, and they continue on in this way. For Britain, a kind of craziness goes back a long time. Starmer is utterly irresponsible, talking about war, talking about planes in the sky, boots on the ground, in a way which could get a lot of people killed, including his countrymen. Totally reckless. Of course, van der Leyen based her whole presidency of the European Commission on war with Russia. She also tried to become head of NATO, which says a lot, because NATO and the European Union became so hopelessly intertwined that one could not distinguish the one from the other. And this was another reason why even issues Ukraine's participation in the European Union got totally entangled with the US-led military alliance. Macron, I have to say, I know him personally, and I just find him inconsistent. I've spoken with him about these issues and heard in private things that are different from what he says in public. I really resent that when we're dealing with life and death issues. And so I think to an extent, they're politicians being politicians. And very importantly, I've said that the war could stop. And it's interesting in Ukraine, we're getting to an end of that war. We are. But why doesn't it stop in one day? Because they're still not saying publicly the truth. What Trump is right. He's trying to get peace there. He says this is Biden's war. This is absolutely right. He's trying to end it. But instead of saying the clear things, NATO will not enlarge, there will be a territorial adjustment given the history of all of this, and there will be security guarantees through the United Nations. The focus has been on a ceasefire without a kind of honest accounting of the underlying reality. I think Steve Witkoff, the negotiator, heard that clearly and gets that clearly and reportedly told President Trump this. But the reason why the war isn't stopping yet isn't that Trump is trying to prolong the war. He's not. But he's using the wrong approach and tactic. He's saying ceasefire, ceasefire. But the point is not a ceasefire. The point is a peace agreement based on certain underlying principles. Ceasefire is pretty meaningless. We saw there was a ceasefire in Gaza and it broke down because it wasn't based on underlying principles. The underlying principle in Ukraine is no NATO enlargement. The underlying principle in the Middle East is simple. It is the state of Palestine as the 194th UN member state. No more, no less. The United States runs a large deficit in its trade in goods and services, what's called the current account of the United States. And that deficit is about $1 trillion. Trump says, oh, that's because other countries are ripping off the United States. I can't even begin to say how absurd that line is. Running a current account deficit means, and it means precisely, that the United States is spending more than it's producing. That's what leads to a deficit. You spend more than you produce. And we spend more than we produce because we have very low saving in this country because we have an enormous budget deficit. So the government is the national credit card. It runs on credit. It transfers money, pays for wars, pays for Israel's wars, pays for military bases in 80 countries around the world, pays for that more than $1 trillion a year military establishment and hundreds of billions of dollars more of associated spending on the military industrial complex. And it gives tax cuts for the richest Americans. And it allows for tax evasion by the richest Americans, and evasion because it doesn't do audits and it guts enforcement of the tax laws. And so we hemorrhage deficits and have rising public debt. Tariffs are going to lower living standards. They're going to wreck the U.S. economy, and they're being put on for unbelievably bizarre and mistaken reasons that are completely fallacious. So all of this is to say that what Trump calls a ripoff is just the absolute irresponsibility of the political class in Washington. It's a corrupt, plutocratic gangsterism that gives away the taxes and tax cuts to the richest people and goes on war after war on credit And that leads to these large deficits that Trump then blames on the other countries. Okay, so now he's going to correct these deficits, he thinks, by raising tariffs. And of course, it's going to do nothing of the kind. And because of all of that, the spending of our country is much larger than our national income. It's $1 trillion more than our national income. It is exactly the imbalance of our imports of goods and services over our exports of goods and services. The deficits are going to continue because they come from the profligacy of Washington. They don't come from the fact that other countries are ripping us off. So he'll raise the tariffs. Americans will shift their spending, say, from an imported automobile to domestic automobiles. That's true. They'll pay higher prices for those domestic automobiles, and our auto industry will export less abroad. So yes, there will be fewer imports and fewer exports, and the balance won't budge. And none of it's going to change the fiscal recklessness, because what's Trump's highest aspiration? It is to continue tax cuts for the richest Americans, which is going to cost another $4 trillion over the next 10 years in the budget, because these tax cuts are supposed to end. But he says, no, these are taxes for my rich donors, so they're going to continue. So I don't know whether it's just rhetoric or ignorance or confusion, but it's unbelievably bad economic policy. It will come to no good. And incidentally, you mentioned rightly that tariffs are, of course, a tax. Who's supposed to have authority over taxes? And Congress has nothing to say in this. This is a one-person show. What did we become in this country? Even King George wouldn't levy taxes without the British Parliament in the 18th century. So what happened to this country? Trump just says, oh, it's an emergency. And now we have one-person rule, and one-person rule on completely fallacious premises that don't pass the first day of study of what a trade deficit is. I taught that for more than 20 years at Harvard University. What is a trade deficit? How does it relate to the excess of spending over production? How does it relate to the excess of investment in a country over a low saving rate? None of this seems to register. No one asks a question. There isn't a day of hearings. There isn't any analysis. It's a one-person show based on economic fallacies that are going to wreck our economy, wreck the world trading system. So he's not going to solve the budget crisis. He's not going to solve the trade deficit, because that comes from the budget crisis. But what he's going to do is lower the living standards of our country and the world, because trade is beneficial in living standards. It's called gains from trade. We buy more cheaply, we sell goods that we have a comparative advantage, and both sides gain from trade. Of course, we overdo it because we overspend, but that's a completely different thing. No one's ripping off the United States by these numbers. And I can tell you, all over the world, because I am talking with leaders all over the world, and recently in Asia, the words to describe this you can't say in polite company. So yes, we're hearing lots of things every day. It's not policy. It is making the entire rest of the world view what's happening in the United States with kind of utter shock at the moment. There's no analysis. There's no systematic policy. There's no law. There is no review. There is no scrutiny. There is one person with his beliefs, his whims, his claims on all of this. And we designed in 1787 in Philadelphia a constitution based on responsibility of three parts of government, assigned tax authority to the Congress, and particularly to the lower house of Congress, where tax legislation has to originate. And our system is being trashed. And it's being trashed for completely erroneous reasons. Why Europe wants continued war, why Europe is incapable of sending an official to Moscow to discuss peace with the Russians is bewildering. It is, among every other consideration, shocking incompetence, period. Maybe that's an explanation. It's not a great explanation, but it is an explanation. Europe should be speaking with Russia. It should be discussing. It should be negotiating. It should be expressing its security concerns. It should be trying to find a way forward. Maybe it would prove impossible, but they don't even try. They do not even try a moment of diplomacy. That is what is absolutely unforgivable. Not a moment of diplomacy. And shame on Starmer, Macron, and others for not even trying. They say they've tried. This is so bizarre, so ignorant of reality. Yes, Macron went to see Putin and he got turned down for what he offered, but that was at a time when Biden was gunning for war and Russia had its eyes on the United States. Now the U.S. is giving them an exit ramp and they cannot find it. They can't take it. They can't understand that this is the best for Europe to have an exit ramp from this war and that it's the best for Ukraine. They simply can't understand that or refuse to. Europe basically doesn't have any foreign policy right now. Europe is in a state of confusion. Of course, France has its traditional role, if I could call it that, in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's around. But Europe is not coherent on any issue right now, not on Ukraine, not on Israel and Palestine, not on the United States. Europe is in a completely discombobulated state, not knowing what to do. And I think probably by the hour, spending most of its time on the coming U.S. tariffs and a little bit of time on Ukraine, and from what I can see, almost no time at all on the Middle East. When the European Commission under Kallas is the External Affairs High Representative, and when Starmer and Macron tried to rally the rest of Europe, most of them stayed away. And so Europe is without any coherence whatsoever right now. A new government is coming into Germany, also talking tough, whether it's only about rearmament or whether it's about German declarations to prepare for war with Russia. We don't know yet. The government's not in place. But it's possible that there's a quite militaristic front of Britain, France, and Germany that tells Zelensky, who, after all, is a dictator right now. He operates under martial law, despite whatever the public wants to save their lives or to end the war. Maybe these three countries in Europe will urge him on, and this will lead to just more mass deaths and more loss of territory by Ukraine, and ultimately to the destruction of Ukraine, I believe. And Ukraine has found at least two supporters in that, Britain and France. Britain's Russophobia knows no bounds. Britain is always ready, it seems, to hate Russia, to maybe provide some limited armaments and to talk tough. France, again, I think unaccountably, is also warmongering. To what effect? None, other than more destruction in Ukraine. And of course, the lead candidate for the presidency of France, Marine Le Pen, disliked the war. Now she's under arrest and has been sentenced to crimes to prevent her from running for president. It's an ugly scene. They need to learn to stop this. And whether they will or not remains to be seen. But I regard the European policy as horrendously confused, divided, and irrational. Maybe they're just so uncreative and without understanding that a neutral Ukraine is the safest possible thing for Ukraine and for them, but they don't get it, and they haven't gotten it for years. Nothing is very clear because no politician in Europe seems to act in the interest of his or her country. They all talk ridiculous things, actually. They are all highly unpopular, and increasingly elections are basically being called off in Europe. In Romania, the lead candidate is prevented from running. In France, the lead candidate is prevented from running. In other countries, a rising anti-establishment vote on the left and the right is manifesting, and the current leaders are highly unpopular. So how to figure this behavior is a bit of a mystery to me, I have to say. I wish I could come on and give you a thorough, convincing explanation of why Starmer and Macron and perhaps Merz talk the way they do when it is an absolutely losing and deadly proposition. But we've had these terrible mistakes for years now. And it's clear, even as Germany is in government formation and all the rest, and even with Scholz, who was to a small extent a moderator of this by saying don't send Taurus missiles and try to find some way forward. The greatest Russophobia, of course, comes from the smallest states, comes from the Baltic states, comes from Poland. That's history. But in terms of the real continuation of the war, this comes from Britain first and foremost, which provides intelligence. I would say it's the opposite of real intelligence, but they provide military intelligence. What an oxymoron. But they provide the weapons and targeting and tactical approaches. And Macron has joined this despite the clear opposition to this from the majority of the French people. And Macron has so little approval in his own country. And all of this last few years has been a big part of the mass disapproval of the French people. This war policy, the sanctions policy, the boomeranging of recession in Europe, all of this is profoundly unpopular. And that's why Marine Le Pen was, of course, far ahead in the opinion polls for the next president until her sentencing yesterday. The one thing coming out of Trump's tariffs as they get implemented is uniting the entire world against the United States. So I don't think that anything good from a U.S. point of view comes out of this. To my mind, this is not only wrong-headed policy from a global geopolitical point of view, it's also economic ignorance. The idea that tariffs are somehow going to reduce a trade deficit that's caused by American budgetary deficit, or that it's going to restore American industry, is completely fallacious. So this is, to my mind, an utterly self-defeating proposition. I don't think it has to bring down the world economy, but it certainly will do great damage to the U.S. economy. What it's going to do is isolate the United States, both economically and diplomatically and geopolitically, from the rest of the world. It will probably bring the rest of the world together to reinforce an open trading system among the rest of the world, and it will weaken rather dramatically the role of the United States in the world if these tariffs actually are put in place and persist. Actions taken by the Trump administration. So I don't think that there's a grand strategy, and I don't think that there is a positive effect that's going to come out of this. In terms of the direction of change, so in this sense, at least vis-a-vis Russia, I think Trump doesn't want to have a fight. With Iran, at least my sense is that they don't view Iran in that context at all. I don't know whether Trump wants or doesn't want a war with Iran, but Iran is not seen in geopolitical terms, say, in relation to US and China as Russia might be. Iran is seen almost entirely through the Israel lens, and Iranian policy is dictated largely through the Israel lobby rather than through any kind of global geopolitics. And Iran is viewed as much weaker and, I suppose, much easier to attack from the point of view of the Trump officials. I think the United States does not view Russia and Iran in the same context at all. They view Russia, according to what Trump says, as, all right, a nuclear superpower, and we can divide up the turf, divide up the spoils with them. Let's not have a war with Russia. Okay, I think that's pretty reasonable, actually, although the specifics of trying to grab Ukraine's minerals and so forth is really gross. You can make peace without this kind of grotesque shakedown and this absolute display of uncontrolled greed and excess. Now, mind you, I don't think any of their analysis is sound, clear-headed, rational, sensible, but probably the way that they view Iran is as weak, subject to attack, and if for whatever reason the U.S. and Israel decide to do that, they're going to do that not because of more broad geopolitical terms, but because of Middle Eastern politics in their perspective.